William Anderton Chisolm Lecture. In 1998, the Francis Asbury Palmer Foundation provided funds to establish an annual lectureship in honor of William Anderton Chisolm for the purpose of educating ministers who would eventually occupy a pulpit. The lecture focuses on areas of the Old Testament. Allison Chisolm, a member of the board and daughter of William Anderton Chisolm, planned to join us. However, inclement weather prevented her from doing so tonight. Note that after the lecture, there'll be time for a question and answer session. And during that time, I'd ask you to come to the mic, which I hope we'll have on by that time, and identify yourself. So all of this will be recorded for posterity. And after the lecture, there will be a reception in the Sarah Smith Gallery to the right of the door. Now I'd like to welcome today's lecturer, Professor Susan Ackerman, who is Professor of Religion and Women's and Gender Studies and Chair of the Department of Religion at Dartmouth College. She joined the Dartmouth faculty in 1990 after teaching at the University of Arizona and Winthrop College in South Carolina. She's a specialist in the religion of ancient Israel and the religions of Israel's neighbors, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan, an interest she first developed as an undergraduate religion major at Dartmouth and continued to explore in graduate school at a famous institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her publications include many articles and 3 books: Warrior, Dancer, Seductress, Queen, Women in Judges and Biblical Israel, Under Every Green Tree, Popular Religion in 6th Century Judah, and When Heroes Love, The Ambiguity of Eros in the Stories of Gilgamesh and David. Her lecture today is entitled Women and Ancient Israelite Household Religion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Susan Ackerman.
We're wired for sound here, so am I on? Yes, I think so. Okay, thank you. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to be here today. I was telling a couple of colleagues before we came downstairs, I haven't been here for 20 years. I spoke at the Yale Divinity School 20 years ago in November of 1986. It was at a point where I was finishing my doctoral work at the institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was looking for a job, and I came here to interview for a position as an assistant professor in Old Testament. It was my first job interview ever in my entire life, and I was so incredibly nervous that when the dean's executive assistant asked me for my social security number, I had no idea what it was. I take as an incredibly good sign today that I reviewed right before the lecture my social security number in my head. I do know it, and so I hope to be able to give you a slightly better talk today than I was able to give in 1986. I have been working, or I'm trying to work, on a book on women in ancient Israelite religion, by which I mean the roles that women played in ancient Israelite religion, but also the sort of religious lives and religious experiences of women within the larger religious tradition of ancient Israel. I told one of my colleagues at Dartmouth that this is what I was working on, and she said to me, "Oh, that sounds so lovely," and I should perhaps say parenthetically, this is a colleague who works in American religion, where you got a lot of sources, right? So she said to me, "Oh, that sounds so interesting, and I'm sure it will make a fascinating pamphlet." I'm trying to be slightly more optimistic than that, but I have come to think of this project as having a kind of detective story quality to it, that there is a lot of digging to try and get at the sort of information that I'm interested in, and in a certain kind of sense, the same kind of digging detectives do, or I'm interested in the same sort of questions, so that if detectives are interested in those questions of who committed a crime, when, where, how, and why, although I don't think of religion as criminal, my questions are the same in terms of who, when, how, where, and why. My who is ancient Israelite religion, but when did ancient Israelite women really express themselves religiously? Were there certain points within the ritual calendar that were particularly important for women's religious expressions? How did women express themselves religiously, and were there significant ways in which women's religious expression was different than men? Why did women participate in certain religious activities, and what was going on theologically that made those activities meaningful for women? And finally, where did women act religiously? Where were the sites of women's worship? And the talk I want to give you today is a little snapshot within that final question, that question of where did ancient Israelite women practice their religious expression. And I want to look at one locus of the practice of that religious expression, and that's within the household where these women lived with their families. Now, to do this, I'm going to eventually be looking at some archaeological evidence with you. I should tell you by way of disclaimer, I'm not an archaeologist. I think of myself as an informed consumer of archaeology, but I'm not an archaeologist. I'm primarily a textual scholar, and so as a textual scholar, I'm going to start with where I'm most comfortable. So I'm going to start with a text, and the text I want to start with is in the book of Judges, chapter 17, verses 1 through 5, and particularly the three verses, verse 1, 4, and 5, that I've put up here. This is a short episode in the book of Judges where the mother of a Ephraimite man named Micah, or in a longer form, Micaiah, it's the same name, just a longer form of the same name, is said to take 200 pieces of silver and give it to a craftsman, or more specifically a silversmith or a metallurgist, and then that silver is cast into a cast metal religious figurine. We're further told in this passage that the man Micah has a shrine, and I think it's a reasonable supposition, although it's not explicitly said here, that this cast metal religious figurine would have stood in that shrine along with the other objects that are listed as being part of it. Now, I think arguably we are to understand this cast metal figurine as an image of the Israelite God Yahweh. And I say that for several reasons. First, Yahweh is the only deity mentioned anywhere in this short passage in Judges 17, 1 through 5, and in the longer passage, Judges chapter 17 and 18, of which this passage is a part. So there's no other deity identified who might be worshipped in this passage. Second, in the verses that I haven't given you here, in verse 2 and 3, Micah's mother is said to utter a blessing in the name of Yahweh in verse 2, and in fact to consecrate her silver to Yahweh in verse 3. So again, I think the image that would be made with that consecrated silver should somehow be an image of Yahweh. Third, I'd noticed that her son, who's named either Micah or Micaiah, carries the name of Yahweh in his very name. Micaiah means something like who is like Yahweh. And in ancient Israel, our data suggests that women more typically than men named their sons. So this woman probably named her own son, or at least the audience would have understood that this woman named her son, and she gives her son a name with the name of Yahweh in it, suggesting she's a Yahweh worshiper, and she would have commissioned a Yahweh figurine. As to what it looked like, I think we have some archaeological evidence that gives us some fairly good guesses. These are small bronze figurines that in this particular case are covered with gold, but there are similar silver-plated figurines that come from the period immediately prior to ancient Israelite history, so from what archaeologists would call the late Bronze Age, but we also have some from the period of Israelite history or the Iron Age as well, and so I think this would make a reasonable supposition for what this cast metal figurine would look like. There's also a quote in the Bible in the prophet Isaiah where Isaiah speaks very briefly of silver-covered figurines and gold-plated images, and again, I think it's that kind of image that an ancient Israelite audience would have envisioned as they thought about this figurine that Micah's mother is said to have made. They may even have envisioned that the figurine would have been in the shape of a bull and coated with silver plating. This is because we're told later on in the story that this figurine is stolen from Micah's household and taken by members of the tribe of Dan, who take it to their own tribal territory and establish it there as an object of worship. Elsewhere in the Bible, we're told that at Dan, there is an image of a bull. And if we're to coordinate those two episodes within the biblical tradition, then maybe we are to see this mother's image that she commissioned as a bull with this silver plating on it or silver coating, stolen by the tribe of Dan, taken to Danite tribal territory, and established there as the object of their worship. But whatever the actual figurine looked like, I would still maintain somehow this was a figurine that was meant to represent the Israelite God Yahweh. I've also suggested that I think we should see this figurine standing in the shrine that Micah is said to have had, along with the other objects that were there, the teraphim and the ephod. Now, we don't know quite exactly what either of these objects were. The best guess about teraphim, I think, currently, is that they were some kind of statue of ancestors that were used in rituals of divination, and more specifically, rituals of necromancy. So you would go to the statues of these deceased ancestors and try and get from them or use them in these rituals in order to get divinatory information. As for the ephod, the other object that's listed here as being in this shrine, we have a lot of different guesses of what the ephod might have been. Most commonly in the Bible, the ephod is described as a kind of overgarment that was worn by a priest and is especially distinguished by, as you can see in this rather imaginative drawing here, by this breastplate in which there were certain gemstones. These gemstones also used in rituals of divination. So it may be that the ephod of our passage was a garment that the priestly son who Micah appointed would have worn. It may be, however, that the ephod was a garment that was draped over the religious figurine itself that the mother had commissioned. The practice of clothing cult statues or religious statues was well known in the ancient Near East, and this is a particular favorite image of mine in this regard. This is from King Tut's tomb from Egypt. It's an image of the jackal god Anubis, and the image is taken, or the photograph was taken, when the tomb was first opened by Howard Carter in 1920, and that statue of Anubis was found with the garment wrapped around it just as it would have been left, whatever that was, 2,500 years previous. So it may be that we should envision the ephod in our passage as a garment that clothed the mother's religious figurine. Another possibility is that the ephod refers to the silver plating itself. In that passage from Isaiah that I showed you already, if we read it quite literally in the Hebrew, it literally reads, "Your images are coated with ephods of gold," so that ephod becomes the gold plating itself. Or finally, sometimes in the Bible, an ephod can be a religious object that itself is worshipped. So for example, in this passage in Judges 8, Gideon makes an ephod to which his family and all the Israelites then bow down. But whatever it is, it does seem fairly clear that the ephod, like the teraphim, was used somehow in rituals of divination. Now, as our story continues on in the next part of Judges chapter 17, we learn more about the religious accommodations of this household. We learn that a young Levite, this is a member of the tribe of Levi, understood in ancient Israel as the priestly tribe or the priestly caste, has left Bethlehem in Judah, where he has been sojourning, and has come to find a place for himself, ending up at the house of Micah in the tribal territory of Ephraim. And again, from the Bible's point of view, this is exactly what Levites should do. They're understood in the Bible as a landless tribe, a tribe that is supposed to scatter its members throughout the tribal territories of all of Israel and serve as priests throughout the tribe. So our young Levite is said to leave Judah and come to the hill country of Ephraim, the tribal territory of Ephraim. And there Micah says to him, asking him to be a father and a priest to him. Father here probably again refers to being some kind of oracular specialist, someone who can perform divinatory rituals. So this priest is asked to serve as an oracular specialist and a priest, and in return he will get room, he will get board, and he will get 10 pieces of silver a year. The Levite agrees to do this, and the young man, we are told, becomes to Micah like a son, I would understand this as meaning here that he really has displaced Micah's biological son, who was previously serving as priest, and has displaced him because he brings more formal qualifications than the kind of ad hoc qualifications that the son seemed to have offered as a priest. And Micah therefore says, now, that is, now that I know I've got this real pro here, I've got this real specialist here, now I know that things will go well for me because the Levite, instead of his biological son, has become my priest. Now, as our story goes on, yet more visitors come to the house of Micah. At about this point, I sometimes think of it as the hotel of Micah. But yet more visitors come to the house of Micah. These are 5 men who are coming from the tribe of Dan. Now, as our story envisions it, Dan, at this point in Israelite history, and our story is envisioning us at a very early point in Israelite history, let's say circa 1150 BCE if we had to put a date to it. At this point, as our story understands it, the tribe of Dan has not yet permanently secured territory for itself. It is temporarily sojourning down in the southwest of Israel, but it's not permanently settled there, and it's looking for permanent settlement. And these 5 scouts have been sent forth to try and find permanent territory for the tribe of Dan. So they come from the southwest, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer here, but they come from the southwest and move through the central hill country of Ephraim, pretty much where it says Israel in bold letters on the map, looking for territory to settle. And as they do, they come in Ephraim to the house of Micah. Now, as they come to the house of Micah, they encounter there Micah's Levite. I actually find this always a quite charming part of the story, because what we're told more specifically is they are taking refreshment or something with Micah, and they overhear the voice of the Levite, and they're said to recognize it. Well, why do they recognize it? Surely not because they've ever met this Levite before. He comes from a completely different place than they are said to come from, but more likely because he, like they, speaks with a southern accent rather than with the northern accent of Ephraim. I'm originally from Arkansas, so this thought that these southerners could sort of recognize each other in this alien territory of northern Yankees is deeply comforting to me. And so, at any rate, they hear the voice of the Levite. They go out to speak to him, and they essentially ask him to do the same work that he's been hired to do for Micah. They ask him to make an oracular inquiry of Yahweh, the God of Israel, asking whether they will be successful in their quest to find permanent settlement for the tribe of Dan. And the Levite replies, as you see here, that they will be successful. And in fact, they travel on to the very far north, to the territory of Laish, and they identify this as suitable territory for the tribe of Dan to settle. There's only one problem, which is there are other people living in Laish. And so the Danites are going to need to conquer this territory if they indeed are going to take it as their own. So these 5 scouts go back to the southwest where the Danites are sojourning. They assemble 600 of their tribesmen who are armed, and with these 600 tribesmen, they march back to the far north to conquer the territory of Laish. And once more, they come through Ephraim, and they pass by the house of Micah. This time, though, the visit from the Danites does not go as well as the previous time. This time, as they're passing by the house of Micah, the 5 original scouts say, hey, this guy's got an ephod, and he's got teraphim, and he's got this cast metal religious figurine all within his house. Wouldn't it be a little nicer if we had those things? And so these Danites resolve, as you again can see here, they resolve to steal the cast metal figurine, the ephod, and the teraphim. Now, as this is going on, the Levite actually sees them and confronts them and says, "What is it that you're doing here?" But they rather quickly persuade the Levite that he would be far better advantaged by keeping quiet and, in fact, coming with them, becoming the priest of an entire tribe rather than just the priest of a single household. You can see here he's rather quickly persuaded that this deal is good for him, and he leaves with the 600 members of the tribe of Dan, along with the cast metal figurine, the ephod, and the teraphim. Now Micah hears about this and does gather men around him and make pursuit to try and reclaim at least his precious religious treasures, if not his priests. But it quickly becomes apparent that Micah, who has gathered the men of his household around him, is no match for these 600 armed men from the tribe of Dan. And these 600 armed men go on to establish themselves at Laish, and Micah goes back home. And so the Danites come to Laish, they set up the figurine there, and the priest, who at this point is named, and rather extraordinarily named as the grandson of Moses, serves them as priest, and this all lasts until the time the land went into exile. That is the time of the Assyrian invasions of the northern part of Israel, beginning in 734 and ending in the final destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. So that's our story, and as I've told it, I've tried to stress, or go to some pains to stress, how many points in this story the phrase "the house of Micah" as the locus of activity shows up. 11 different times in this relatively short 2-chapter text, we get this phrase, "the house of Micah." But as we begin to look at these 11 different instances where the house of Micah is mentioned, it should quickly become apparent to us that the house of Micah is not house as we would think of it in the 21st century. That is, it's not a freestanding, single-family house. Rather, what seems to be meant by house of Micah is an extended household compound in which there are several houses or several buildings. And I just want to show you a couple of verses that I think especially illustrate this. First, in Judges chapter 18, verses 13 through 14, where we're told that the Danites come to the house of Micah, and then they say, this is the 600 Danites who've come to the house of Micah, and then the 600 are told, "Did you know that in these buildings," that is, the house of Micah is comprised of several buildings. Also, in chapter 18, verse 22, again, these Danites have now fled from the house of Micah, and the men who were in the houses that were in the house of Micah, kind of a bizarre phrase to be in the houses that were in the house, but what is meant here is, I think, the men who were in the many houses or many buildings that were part of the extended household compound that makes up, in a more global sense, the house of Micah. So the house of Micah equals one of these extended compounds. Now, I think one of the buildings that was in this extended compound, our story suggests, is a separate and distinct shrine building. The shrine that was mentioned for us already in Judges chapter 17, verse 5. Now, I will quickly admit this verse does nothing to indicate that the shrine is a separate and distinct building. But I think a couple of other mentions of the shrine do suggest this. First, in chapter 18, verse 3, this is when the 5 original scouts are taking refreshment or whatever they're doing with Micah in his personal domicile. And they overhear the voice of the Levite, they recognize it, and they turn aside to speak to him there. Well, where's the there? Given that this Levite is a priest, I think most probably the there is a separate and distinct shrine building over which this Levite presides. And even, I think, more tellingly, Judges chapter 18, verse 15, we get a description of the Danites coming to the house of the young Levite that was in the house of Micah. So some separate building that is assigned to the Levite that's in the extended household compound of Micah. The building that I would suggest to you is a separate shrine building. Now, all of this has been illuminated for us in the last 25 years by a rather extraordinary set of archaeological discoveries that really have focused on excavating small Israelite villages rather than major urban centers that were previous focus of excavations. And what these excavations of villages have revealed is that archaeologically, an extended household compound, just as the one that seems to be described in Judges chapter 17 through 18, was the standard architectural configuration of at least ancient Israelite village life for at least the period of the pre-exilic period, that is until 586, when the southern kingdom of Judah falls to the Babylonians, and even, it seems, into New Testament times. This is just where people lived. What archaeologists have told us is that within these extended household compounds, the standard unit is what's called sometimes the four-room house, sometimes called the courtyard house, sometimes called the pillar courtyard house. All of these are names that are attempting to describe the distinctive features of these houses that make up these larger compounds. And the distinctive feature, I've been very struck in my hour here in Yale Divinity School this afternoon, is actually arranged just like your campus. It's a big U shape around a central courtyard. So you can see it perhaps better in the drawing on the right, the isometric drawing. There's a central courtyard that then has a U-shaped complex of rooms around it, either one broad back room or two broad back rooms, and then rooms that are set on the side that are set away from the courtyard by pillars. Often there's four of these rooms making the U plus courtyard, which is why it's sometimes called the four-room house. But pillar courtyard is probably somewhat better. Now, within these houses, we know a certain amount about what went on. They seem to be farmhouses, which would make perfect sense given that we're looking at rural or village environments. And within the houses, the central courtyard seems to have been used primarily for food preparation and food processing. You can see in this particular image, for example, a woman who's grinding grain. You can see there's a fire for cooking food. The room in the back seems to have been used primarily for food storage, and you perhaps see that better in the image on the right, where you can see an enormous number of store jars that would have been used there for storage. The two rooms on the side that are set off with the pillars seem to have been used by these rural families for stabling their animals. And they often, in fact, have cobbled floors instead of dirt floors to make the stabling easier. And some of them have even been found with stone mangers for feeding the animals. For the family, the living space, the eating space, the sleeping space, the entertaining space was on the floor above. In the winter, it would have been nicely heated, although perhaps somewhat malodorous, but nicely heated by the animals below. In the summer, the roof could be used for eating, for sleeping, for entertainment, as it would have afforded a breeze and perhaps been a little bit cooler. Now, within these pillar courtyard houses, archaeologists have also made attempts, and I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Carol Myers at Duke University, have made attempts to think about gender roles within these pillar courtyard houses. For men, the gender roles seem primarily to have to do with the more physically demanding aspects of agricultural work. This would mean clearing fields for cultivation, plowing those fields, planting those fields, and once the crop is ready, harvesting the crop, and then conveying the crop back to the house or the village. And I think this image represents rather well exactly how much work that would have been. Typically the villages, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner there, were on top of hills. The fields where you can plant crops, though, are in the valleys below. So the work of getting the crops as much as a mile back to the village is actually fairly significant labor. And it, again, seems to be labor that's mostly assumed by men. Women's roles tend to be associated first more with food processing once the crops are brought back to the house, and food production, and particularly with the converting of raw grain into bread. Carol Myers, again, has estimated that women would have spent as much as 2 hours a day, every day, grinding grain to make the flour, and then kneading the flour to make the dough, and then taking the dough to bake it into bread. An enormously time-consuming activity for women. Women also took primary responsibility for textile production within the household, and I'm just showing you some images here that suggest not only within ancient Israel, but throughout the ancient Near East, women took primary responsibility for textile production. The image in the upper left-hand corner is actually one of the oldest pieces of art, and I use the term rather loosely here, but one of the oldest pieces of art we have from ancient Mesopotamia. It's about 3000 BCE, and what it's showing you is 3 women sitting around a loom and engaged in weaving textiles. Exactly the same work is being done in this Egyptian image that's on the right that comes from about 1800 BCE, women weaving cloth in a loom. The final image is from Persia. It's about the 4th century BCE, and it shows a woman spinning, but basically women doing this work of textile production. Women also undoubtedly took primary responsibility for child care within these households, and I always love this image of this poor woman who seems to be nursing an 8-year-old. And finally, and perhaps a little bit unexpectedly, women, it seems, also took primary responsibility for domestic pottery production within the household. Most of the pottery that was used within these households was made within the household for use within these fairly self-sufficient spaces, and women seem to have taken primary responsibility for that. Now, I'll come back to this issue of gender roles in just a minute, but first let me just complete the tour of these households and the compounds in which they're established. So again, the basic unit is these 4-room or pillar courtyard or courtyard houses, but these then get brought together into an extended compound, and in fact quite closely brought together. I think you particularly see this in the image on the left that comes from Tel Masos in 11th century Israel. And you can see here 4 different pillar courtyard houses. The dots are the clues. Those are the pillars, right? So you can see 4 of these different pillar courtyard houses that are in an extended compound together, and in fact so closely together that they abut. They share the same walls. A slightly harder image to read on the right here from Khirbet Radana, but again you see a house with its pillars on the right. You see another house with its pillars on the left, and notice in the center you see an open air courtyard with cooking pits that these 2 houses would have shared. Here's an artist, again, somewhat fanciful reconstruction of these 2 houses within a walled and gated compound. And it's interesting in our Judges text that actually the compound is described as being walled and having a gate. So a walled and gated compound in which there are 2 of these individual pillar courtyard houses, but then this common open courtyard that, as you can see here, would have been used for more food production. It, on the left, has a taboon or an oven that would have been used for baking. It obviously has a cistern for watering animals, some small-scale crop production even within the courtyard, a small little vineyard there, some fruit trees, some nut trees, the animals running crazy. And I always love this feature over here in the corner, that brown hump, that's the dung heap from the remains of the stables within the houses. Now, so these houses have these open courtyards in common. We also have one piece of evidence from the 11th century BCE village from Ai that suggests that these households that are grouped together in this extended compound could also have in common a dedicated shrine room. Very similar, I think, to what's described for us in Judges chapters 17 and 18. At I, the room in question is room number 65, and I know you probably cannot read 65 on this diagram here, but it's the room in the upper right-hand corner, the room that only we can see the bottom wall and the left-hand wall on the side. But that's room number 65, associated with these other structures that seem to be houses. But room 65 doesn't seem to be a house. It seems to be a shrine. Well, how do we know this? Well, we know it, or archaeologists think they know it, for several reasons. First, the room is larger than any other single room at the site, which may suggest that it has a special purpose or a special function for which it is used. The room's about 28 feet long by 10 feet wide, and again, larger than any other single room at the site. More significant is that on two walls of the room, and that's the southern wall and the western wall, archaeologists found benches along the edge of the wall. And we know this kind of bench from other religious structures. This, for example, is an image that comes from gate shrines that are at the site of Kentillet Ashrud in the Sinai. These benches are a typical feature of religious architecture in ancient Israel. They are not used for worshipers to sit on, and I think you can see, looking at especially the ones on the right, that they would be rather uncomfortable to sit on. They're used for worshipers to leave offerings, to leave food offerings, to leave drink offerings, to leave other kinds of dedicatory offerings. They're meant to be a platform on which you can leave offerings. So the fact that there are benches at our room in I suggests that these are benches to be used for dedicatory offerings. Now you can see on the bench on the western wall, the southern wall, that's the southern wall. You can see on the bench in the southern wall that there's a rather significant piece of pottery. This stands somewhere between 2 and 2.5 feet tall, and I'm sorry I can't be more specific about this. Actually, the excavation report says 2 feet on one page and 2.5 feet on the next page, which is just the kind of thing that drives scholars crazy. But there it is. It's 2 or 2.5 feet tall, this rather elaborate pottery object with these fenestrations or holes carved in it, and then these rather cute feet that are arrayed around the bottom. Some scholars think human-shaped feet, other scholars think feet that are in the shapes of lions. But whatever it is, it seems quite clear that this piece of pottery is not functional. It's not a punch bowl, for example. It seems to have some other purpose, and the supposition is a religious purpose. The other pottery found in the room is equally unusual. There's a large bowl with stubby protrusions that was found just below the footed piece of pottery. There is a chalice-shaped piece of, a funnel-shaped piece of pottery that was probably meant for offering libations. It probably sat on top of another vessel, maybe even on top of this vessel, and was used for pouring out libations. And then a very substantial jug that is sitting next to that. None of this is domestic pottery. All of it seems to have some extraordinary, and as I say, the hypothesis is religious use in this room. Now, as we think about that, I think if we look at 11th century we should think about this room as being the distinct and dedicated shrine room that is used by one of I's extended household compounds. And I'm just showing you here a plan of 11th century I. Ignore this really big building at the bottom. That's a much earlier building. It's not Israelite. What we're interested in are these clusters of household compounds that are at the top of the slide that made up the Iron Age village of I. When I was excavated in the 1960s, the archaeologist Joseph Calloway estimated that this Iron Age village of about the 11th century had somewhere between 150 to 300 inhabitants. That's enough people to fill about 10 to 20 of these extended household compounds. And again, my suggestion to you would be that room 65 was the distinct or dedicated shrine room for one of these household compounds. Now, I want to get to a quote here in my text. So, now as we think about these, that was really brilliant, wasn't it? But I know what page I'm looking for now. Problem is I'm blind as a bat, so I can't see my own typing anymore. Okay. So, as we think about these household compounds, again, I would suggest to you that this is analogous to what we have described for us in Judges chapter 17 and 18, that this is a household shrine that is used by members of a household compound. It's used for members of those household compounds to stop by, to leave a food offering, a drink offering, burn an incense offering. And I might just note in this regard with our particular room at I that this room had a channel in its floor, the only room at the site that had such, probably used for draining away libation offerings or drink offerings. So as we think about the members of these household compounds coming to these distinct or dedicated shrine rooms and leaving offerings, should we think about women coming and leaving offerings? Did women worship in these kinds of spaces? I think our evidence from Judges 17 through 18 allows us to suggest at least a qualified yes. That is, I think our evidence from Judges chapter 17 and 18 allows us to suggest that women at a minimum could help furnish these shrines, that a woman like Micah's mother could commission a cast metal figurine and then expect to see that cast metal figurine stood within the dedicated shrine room that was part of her household compound. In fact, I think the evidence from Judges chapter 17 to 18 allows us to suggest that women could expect to provide the most valuable furnishings within these household shrines. And I say this because such images as we're looking at here, made of cast in bronze and then covered with silver plate, are made obviously of metals exceptionally rare and consequently exceptionally precious within ancient Israel, and surely the focal point of any shrine that held an object like that. In fact, I would suggest that Micah's mother could reasonably expect that her cast metal figurine would stand in her family's household shrine in exactly the same position that the elaborate pottery object that we looked at previously with the feet around its base stood in the household shrine at Ai, on the most prominent point on one of these raised benches. And I think crucial to note in this regard is to think about the feet and the suggestion of William Deaver, who's a noted archaeologist, that the feet represent the feet of the Israelite god Yahweh, and the pottery vessel represents Yahweh's temple with its doors and with its windows. So what do the feet symbolize? They symbolize that Yahweh is at home in his temple, and consequently symbolize within the shrine room at Ai that the Israelite God is present and resident there. Similarly, if I'm right that Micah's mother's cast metal figurine represents somehow an image of Yahweh, if I'm further right that that cast metal figurine stood within a dedicated shrine room, and if I'm right further still in saying that it would be the most precious object of the shrine room, then again what I think we are seeing here is the ability of a woman to dedicate to a shrine its most precious object, to see it as the focal object of the shrine, and indeed the very evidence of the God present in the shrine. As we think about this just for one more minute, I would remind you furthermore of our evidence that women in ancient Israel made the pottery. So a woman could have well made the pottery image that stood in eye on the left. A woman is described for us in Judges as making the cast metal figurine, which we're seeing a possible reconstruction of on the right. Again, I think an extraordinary, powerful role for women, to be understood as the primary patron of the household shrine, the one who has given to it its most valuable and sacred object. That said, as so often the case in the Bible, while on the one hand able to admit or at least hint at powerful religious roles for women, can never seem to quite embrace this idea absolutely. And in our Judges story, that means that in Judges 17:4, after we get the notice of Micah's mother commissioning this cast metal figurine, we never hear another word about this woman again. Did she continue to worship, for example, in the shrine where her cast metal figurine would have stood? Did she come to it daily to bring dedicatory offerings and to continue to mark its value to her and to her family? Common sense suggests to me that she would indeed do this, but our text is mute. It tells us nothing about this woman's role in the continuing life of her family's shrine. But I'd like to take my last few minutes this afternoon to look at a couple of other biblical texts that I think might help illuminate this issue of women's continuing role in family household worship after the shrine is established and finished. The first of these texts comes from the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah chapter 7. Now, in looking at this text from the biblical point of view, we've moved forward several centuries in history. This text is set at the end of the 7th century or beginning of the 6th century, so let's say circa 600 or so, shortly before the southern kingdom of Judah and its capital city of Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. In this text, God is speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, and God is indicating his rather significant displeasure with the people of Jerusalem and Judah. And in fact, such a great displeasure that God commands to Jeremiah, do not pray for this people, do not raise a cry or prayer on their behalf, do not intercede with me, for I will not hear you. And why not? Because don't you see what they are doing in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. A very kindred text is found in Jeremiah chapter 44. This text is set, let's say, about 20 years later or so. By the time of this text, Judah and Jerusalem have in fact fallen to the Babylonians. A small group of refugees from Jerusalem has fled to Egypt, and they have taken Jeremiah with them. In Egypt, this group of refugees seems to continue in the religious practices they were engaging in according to chapter 7. That is, they seem still to be worshiping this goddess called the Queen of Heaven. And even though Jeremiah again chastises them for doing so, they basically say, we're not going to listen to you, but we intend instead to keep making offerings to the Queen of Heaven, to pour out libations to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials, used to do in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. And the women in particular said, indeed, we are going to go on making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations to her. Now, I think there are many interesting issues that are raised by these two texts. Who is the Queen of Heaven, who is never given a name but simply called by this epithet, the Queen of Heaven? Why in both texts are women particularly associated with her worship? But I want to focus here, given my interest in this particular talk, on where women worship. I want to focus on the question of where this goddess was worshipped and what this might tell us about women's religious lives. Now, this particular passage answers my question a little bit. Where was the Queen of Heaven worshipped? In the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. But I have to say, I don't find that a great deal of specificity. I think we get perhaps a little bit more clue in the words that are immediately preceding where we're told that the people who used to worship the Queen of Heaven in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem were our ancestors, but also our kings and our officials. Now, as we think about these kings and officials and where they might worship the Queen of Heaven, it seems to me reasonable to suggest that they would worship her in kingly buildings or official buildings, that is, in either palaces or large administrative buildings. And even though this particular archaeological evidence predates the Jeremiah text by 3 centuries, I think it might give us some hint. You're looking here in the upper left at what's called Building 338 from 10th century BCE Megiddo. And as you can see, Building 338 has a room 340, which is labeled a shrine room. In it were found all kinds of what look like religious objects, small altars, and also pottery vessels very similar to the kinds of vessels we saw in Ai. So where are kings and officials worshiping the Queen of Heaven? Quite plausibly, I think, in shrine rooms within public buildings, such as this shrine room at Megiddo. But I don't think that's where, for example, the group described in Jeremiah 7 is worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Here we are told that in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, the children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. This doesn't seem at all to imply any kind of palace setting or any kind of official setting. These seem to be non-elites. It seems to be a regular, everyday Judahite families who are worshiping the Queen of Heaven by gathering wood, kindling fire, and kneading dough to make offering cakes in her honor. Where would this kind of activity go on? It has to go on, I think, within those same kind of households that I've shown you previously. It's within these households that the grains were stored that would be needed to make the dough. It's within these households that women grind grain and knead dough. It's within these households where there are cooking pits and ovens, all the things needed according to our text to make these offerings to the Queen of Heaven. Now, within these household compounds, once the cakes are made for the Queen of Heaven, what is then done with them? Well, one thing that might be done with them is that they are then taken to a dedicated shrine room, such as room 65 at Ai. But it's also possible, and I think perhaps in this case more probable, that we should envision these offering cakes as being offered to the Queen of Heaven in small shrines that were within individual houses themselves. This is again something that is well attested for us in the archaeological record, and I'm just showing you a couple of examples here. First from House 440 that's at the site of Tel El Farah in the north. There is quite irritatingly a Tel El Farah in the south, so you always have to differentiate Tel El Farah north and Tel El Farah south. House 440 at Tel El Farah had in its central courtyard one of those small benches that we've now seen several times. And again, I would suggest to you a bench that was used for dedicatory offerings. It's notable that the house did generate some remains that look quite religious, and I'd particularly draw your attention to the very fragmentary statue that's on the left-hand side of this slide that is a woman with her head broken off and with her legs broken off, so you're only seeing the torso, but she's holding a round object. She well may be holding the kind of offering cake that Jeremiah describes for us, the cake that she would then take to put on the offering bench within the courtyard to make an offering to the Queen of Heaven. Similarly, some household remains from Beersheba that suggest again the kind of religious activities that could go on within small shrines within a household. And again, I would suggest to you this is where we should envision these offerings happening in our Jeremiah text. I would also suggest to you in our Jeremiah text that we have to take the role of women as the most crucial within the text. Sure, the children gather wood. Sure, the fathers kindle the fire. but the actual kneading of the dough, as we're seeing a woman doing here, and the baking of the offering cake, a cake that we're actually told is made in the image of the Queen of Heaven. And this may help us envision this a little bit. This is the equivalent of an ancient Jell-O mold for baking a cake in an image of a woman, and this may be exactly what we're supposed to see in terms of baking a cake in the image of the Queen of Heaven. But I think as we think about these cakes being made, it is women who perform this most crucial role of actually kneading the dough and baking the cake, and it is only logical that it is women who form, sorry, that's actually not the slide I wanted. Let's see if we can get to the slide I want. It's only logical that women perform this particular role because this is what women do in houses. This is what we saw that they do. They do food production and they do food preparation. So when it is necessary to prepare food, not just for one's family members, but now for the gods who are venerated in one's household, it logically makes sense that it is women who would do this work. I'd further like to remind you that within ancient Israel, this kind of act of religious devotion, making a food offering, making a drink offering, making an incense offering, pouring out a libation, is the central act of worship. I think sometimes this is hard for us to wrap our heads around because we live in an environment where religion is far more dematerialized, and we don't think of these nitty-gritty acts of feeding the gods as being an act of central devotion. But for the ancient Israelites, it was. And so as we look at these women actually making these cakes and making these offerings, we are looking at them as central, critical, crucial actors in the exercise of household religion. So what I would say to you in sum is that ancient Israelite women must be understood as having been integrally involved in the rituals of ancient Israelite household religion. As in our Judges text in chapter 17, verse 4, women could serve as the patrons and even the primary patrons of their household shrines, commissioning the sacred objects that were the focal point of worship. Likewise, in Jeremiah chapter 7 and 44, women would have been active and essential participants in devotional acts, preparing the food and drink offerings for a household god or gods, presenting these food or drink offerings that were required for the household devotions. Women's contributions, I would conclude, within this spectrum of ancient Israelite household religion were absolutely central.
Turn it on. So we will record this. And just tell us who you are.
Because you are being recorded here for posterity.
Right, I'll go first. I'm Dale Martin. This is all new to me because this is so much earlier than the stuff that I specialize on. And I know something about Greek religion of times a little bit after this, but what were there sacrifices besides food offerings and drink offerings going on at any of these places? Animal sacrifices, and if so, where did they take place? And if so, did women have a role in that? Because women did have sort of recognized roles in ancient Greek sacrifice.
I think when we start looking for animal sacrifices, we need to look beyond the household to looking to actual designated sanctuary spaces, either big national temples like we're at Dan or like we're at Jerusalem, but more probably regional sanctuaries such as we're at Shiloh. And I think as we think about women's roles there, the text we should think about is the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. If you remember the story, Hannah is barren, but she goes to Shiloh. She prays to God that her barrenness will be ended, and indeed, as always seems to happen for these barren women in the Bible, her barrenness is ended. She bears this child, Samuel, and she then dedicates him to Yahweh's service at Shiloh. And when it's time to bring Samuel to Shiloh to be dedicated to Yahweh's service, Hannah comes with her husband Elkanah, and the text is quite interesting here because it said, and she brings a 3-year-old bull, 3/8 of an ephah of flour, which she undoubtedly ground, which we don't think about nearly enough, I think, but 3/8 of an ephah of flour, which she undoubtedly ground, and a skin of wine. And she and Elkanah then go to the altar, according to the Masoretic or the Hebrew text, and they slaughtered the bull, actually according to the Greek text, and she slaughtered it. However whichever of the textual traditions you're going to go with, I think there's where it's in those more regional sanctuaries that you look for animal sacrifice, but at least in that text, the woman seems to me to be an integral player. I should just say further about that text is the sacrifice that's offered is the Salamim sacrifice, which is a sacrifice where the fat and the blood are given to God, and the rest of the sacrifice is cooked and eaten by the worshipers. And again, I don't think we think about this nearly often enough, but who was cooking that meal? So to that degree, I think women are involved as well.
Meyer. I have a question concerning Jeremiah. Mm-hmm. You said that you connected what we read in Jeremiah 7 to household religion in Israel. But Jeremiah 7 is a temple sermon. It is a sermon spoken in Jerusalem, in the temple precinct. And don't you think that there are some differences between households in the city, households in these family compounds in the villages? Is there some development of household religion in between? And there is a question, the Queen of Heaven worshipped is a despised deity. So the text goes in polemic against this deity. Whereas the Micah image, or the image casted for and paid by Micah's mother, is a Yahweh image, and it is not, there's no polemic against the image in the text. So can we just, my question is also a question of method. Can we compare all texts to each other? Can we kind of draw from every single text we have? And the third point is also, you have a lot of pictures, and it's great to have this imagery there. But the Queen of Heaven, is she not kind of an astral deity, meaning that she's a star, something? So her shape would be a star and not a woman, if you take bakes in the image of her. So how could we compare all the things? Okay,
I've lost all. Let me see if I can. I've lost some of these questions. Let me go back to the first question, then you're going to have to prompt me as we start going through some of these questions. The first question was, I think, about the urban setting versus the more rural setting. And I would say yes and no in terms of differences we're talking about in terms of households. Certainly in an urban setting, you cannot have these extended household compounds. You simply do not have the land to dedicate to these extended household compounds. And you're also in an urban setting not running off an agricultural economy. That said, I think some of the basic observations about the work of the household and about gender roles in the household and about what happens in the household are easily going to carry over from the rural setting to the urban setting. So within an urban setting, even though you're not producing your own food, you are nevertheless, the women are going to take the role as primary food producers within the household. And again, I would suggest not just producing food for their family members, but in this particular case, producing food for the deities who are venerated in the household. In terms, I'm now going to skip a question. Polemic was third, so what was second? Well, let me say something about polemic. I find polemics quite interesting. And polemical texts are indeed polemical, and their evidence becomes problematic in certain ways because of their polemic. That said, I don't believe there's any such thing as a pointless polemic. Polemics aren't about beating a dead horse, and the polemic can be used to reveal evidence about what is going on, I believe, and about which the text or the prophet is polemicizing. And I might just say in this regard, it's more subtle in Judges, but that text is polemical too. That text is intended to denigrate the Danites and especially the religious activities of the Danites by suggesting that the Danites center their religious activities around a stolen figurine, and that's not really very laudable in certain ways. So that text has a polemical quality as well. Further, in terms of method, I would be very unoptimistic about our ability to try and trace any kind of development in terms of women's religion generally in ancient Israel or household religion simply because we don't have the data. And I think that would actually be maybe my final comment about method is, while it's maybe not the purest or most unassailable method to pick and choose among the texts, in terms of, I think, what I'm trying to ask questions about, I don't know that there are many alternatives because the data's not there. I will, having said I'd said that, I'll answer the Queen of Heaven. I've worried about the Queen of Heaven a great deal. I think the Queen of Heaven is an astral deity, but she is an astral deity who seems to me to be a syncretism of Mesopotamian Ishtar and Canaanite Astarte, both of whom can be called in text the Queen of Heaven. And certainly we can find anthropomorphic images of Ishtar, and we can find anthropomorphic images of Astarte. So I have no problem with saying there could be an anthropomorphic image of the Queen of Heaven.
Following on from the Queen of Heaven, do you have want to say anything about those pillar figurines? Gotcha.
Oh, sure. These so-called pillar figurines are figurines that are rather ubiquitously found in archaeological excavations from Iron Age Israel, somewhat from the north, and certainly frequently enough in the north, but especially in the south and in Judah. They're called pillar figurines because it's meant to describe the way they look. They are figurines whose base is a pillar, or it looks like a column. Then above the waist, they become anthropomorphic. They are female. They are shown having enormous breasts and a fairly unmodeled head, but nevertheless it seems a hairstyle that seems more to indicate a female than a male. And again, the breasts are pretty much a giveaway that they're looking at a female. These are found, as I say, ubiquitously in archaeological contexts, but most commonly within archaeological contexts that are either domestic or domestically associated, tombs, for example. So they're found either in family households or family tombs. My own preference is to think of them as figurines of the mother goddess Asherah. And I say this first because I think these figurines suggest motheredness, right? The emphasis on the breast suggests the maternal feature of nursing. But second, because Asherah, when she is imaged in non-human form, is most commonly described as a tree. And I'm somewhat inclined to think of the pillar below the waist as the trunk of the tree, and the breast above the waist as the human form of Asherah, the mother goddess. The other common guess that's out there is that these are somehow votive or dedicatory objects used by women who are either hoping to bear healthy children or nurse their children so that the children will come of age, and that they are meant to be sort of almost magical objects of a nursing woman meant to propitiate the gods. But I tend to put more weight on thinking of them actually as an image of the mother goddess.
My name is Julie Parker. I first would like to thank you so much for your really interesting talk and also the highly engaging way in which you presented it. I'm really intrigued by your suggestion that this figure is a Yahweh figurine. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask you, if this is the Deuteronomistic history and there's so much polemic against these Pesalim, how do you think it could stand in the text without a polemic against it?
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding your question correctly, but again, I would say, I think it does have a...
that figurine, text sanctioning that figurine, Yahweh figurine.
Yeah, I think the text, as I suggested already, it does have a certain polemical quality, certainly later on in the text where it is polemicized against the Danites because they've stolen the figurine, and so they've centered their whole religious worship around a stolen figurine. But I should perhaps tell you about verses 2 and 3, which I didn't put up on the slide because it's a whole different can of worms. But in verse 2, what we're told is that the mother had 1,100 pieces of silver that her son stole from her. But she doesn't know who stole it. She simply knows it has been stolen. She utters a curse, cursing the thief who has stolen the silver. And this curse, which I think we need to presume has religious implications. It's in the name of a god, and I would guess in the name of Yahweh. This curse scares the son enough that he returns the silver. He says, you know that silver that was stolen from you? I took it. The mother at that point turns and utters a blessing to negate the curse, and then dedicates 200 pieces of silver to make the figurine. So the figurine is not only stolen when the Danites steal it. The figurine starts from stolen silver, which I think has a slightly, I'll take out the slightly, I think has a polemical quality to it. It's further been suggested, which I don't agree with, that the fact that the woman only gives 200 pieces of the silver as consecrated to Yahweh and holds back 900 pieces of the silver is further intended as a polemic that she's chintzy when it comes to the worship of the Israelite God. Does that?
Sort of. I mean, are you saying that the text said it's fine here to make a three-dimensional figure of Yahweh? That's really what I'm asking.
Okay, I would suspect, and these things are always hard to suss out, I would suspect that we have an original story that presumes it's fine to make a three-dimensional image of Yahweh. And we have other evidence from ancient Israel that suggests that at least some ancient Israelites agreed with that presumption. I don't at all think the Deuteronomist agrees with that presumption. And so what the Deuteronomist is able to do is take that story, which I think was originally neutral or made no judgment against this, and give it this somewhat polemical twist by calling into question the motives of the mother and or the origins of the silver and the origins and then what happens to the image as it ends up in Dan. Would be my suggestion about it.
Maybe this is a good point to call a halt to the formal conversation, and we'll continue the conversation over some wine and cheese out in the Summer Spring Gallery. Let's all give a hand to our